Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to you joining us here in person in KEI studios and also online. My name is Clint Work. I am Fellow and Director of Academic Affairs at KEI. And given recent developments in bilateral relations between Seoul and Tokyo and the effect this has on improving trilateral relations between the US, the ROK, and Japan, KEI has set out to hold a series of programs examining trilateral relations. Moving forward, we're going to have a program looking at the economic implications of trilateral relations, but today's program focuses specifically on trilateral relations and the concept of integrated deterrence. And this is driven partly by our curiosity about what exactly integrated deterrence means. In the 2022 National Defense Strategy, the U.S. Department of Defense called integrated deterrence the cornerstone of the NDS, defining it as having a combat-credible American force, quote, working seamlessly across warfighting domains, theaters, the spectrum of conflict, other instruments of U.S. national power, and our unmatched network of alliances and partnerships, and bolstered or backed by the U.S. nuclear deterrent. However, it remains unclear exactly what this means, or more pointedly, how U.S. allies and partners who are critical to this view or understand the concept, or how it can best be implemented. And we have a wonderful set of speakers to help us explore this, maybe help pin down this definition. But before I get to them, I do want to mention that I'm going to use three terms that come from a fantastic CNAS report written, co-authored by Stacy Pettyjohn and Becca Wasser, who's one of our speakers here today. And we have some of those in hard copy out in the vestibule, and also we'll share the link to that report online for those of you who are joining us virtually. And the report, I think, does a wonderful job of helping us think about integrated deterrence, particularly three different levels of integration, and that is tactical integration, institutional integration, and strategic integration. And I might just quickly define those terms as they're defined in the report, just to give us a baseline for our discussion. Tactical integration is the most visible form of multilateral defense cooperation and the most common. It emphasizes interoperability between America and its allies and partners through common or compatible equipment and shared tactics. And this can be through foreign military sales, military exercises and training. Second is institutional integration. And this is a deeper form of cooperation that requires higher levels of trust, as it involves incorporating allies and partners into DoD decision-making processes. Institutional integration tends to center around a few areas, including information sharing, research and development, and capability development, acquisition, and production. And then finally, strategic integration is the most important, but arguably the hardest to achieve, as strategic and policy differences have long been significant barriers to deepening integration with allies and partners. Strategic integration entails DoD and allies and partners developing a common understanding and prioritization among threats and agreeing on a division of labor for how to counter them. So in theory, as Becca and Stacy outline in the report, tactical and institutional integration or cooperation should flow from discussions and decisions made in strategic integration. However, in the world, the messy reality of the world, that is not how it often plays out. And I thought I'd highlight one key quote that came from their report when they were asking different allied officials about integrated deterrence. One of them said that they have two problems with integrated deterrence. One is integration, and the other is deterrence. So that gives you a sense of the sort of skepticism or questions that allies are raising about what this concept means. And I'm going to put it on our wonderful speakers to help us better define and answer what this means. And just to introduce them briefly, and their longer bios are on our website. As I've already alluded to, Becca Wasser is Senior Fellow for the Defense Program and lead of the Gaming Lab at the Center for a New American Security, or CNAS. Jim Schaaf, next to her, is Senior Director of the US-Japan Next Alliance Initiative at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. And joining us from late at night in Seoul, South Korea, is Dr. Bi-Yoon Jo, who is Associate Research Fellow at the Center for Security and Strategy at the Korea Institute for Defense Analysis, or KIDA. So let's get right to it. I think I sort of gave some of this answer in my opening remarks, but I wanted to turn to you, Becca, and ask how the 2022 NDS defines integrated deterrence, and what does the United States see as the role of allies and partners in this concept?
Yeah, well, first off, thank you so much for inviting me to talk about this topic, which is obviously near and dear to my heart. But, I think there's a lot of confusion centered around integrated deterrence for a variety of reasons that we're probably going to delve into today. But if you're looking at how DoD defines integrated deterrence, if I can sort of paraphrase what you had said earlier, it's DoD trying to integrate all tools of national power, so from the military to the economic to the information, trying to integrate across geographies, trying to integrate across the spectrum of conflict, so from competition and pre-conflict phases to conflict and post-conflict as well, and then working with allies and partners, all backed up by a nuclear deterrent. So really what this means is the United States is trying to deter while working with allies and partners. And the emphasis here is on conventional deterrence, I think. There is that backstop of a nuclear deterrent, but the push really is to work with allies and partners in the conventional domain. This definition is a little bit of a grab bag. It's kind of everything under the sun. It's not really well defined. So it could be anything and everything. And there's a question of how it differs from plain old deterrence. I would argue it probably doesn't. But what the most important takeaway here is that integrated deterrence is the allies and partners line of effort in the 2022 US National Defense Strategy. And this is why the DoD has pointed to allies and partners as the center of gravity for the strategy, because without them, all of the US best laid plans and prioritization can't occur. And so if I could just provide a little bit of a strategic context here for why that's the case and why the United States is emphasizing allies and partners so much, I think it'll make a little bit more sense. If you look at everything that the United States needs to do right now, which is really trying to deter two major conventional and nuclear armed adversaries in Europe and the Indo-Pacific, trying to keep other persistent threats, to steal a DoD term, at bay. And so this usually refers to Iran, North Korea, violent extremist organizations, and to do so to protect the US homeland while still trying to uphold its extended deterrence commitments to allies and partners around the world. This comes at a really unique juncture for the US Department of Defense and the US military, where they've placed some big bets on future force modernization and have had to make some cuts in force size and structure in order to make those happen. But the fruits of force modernization have not yet come to fruition. So you kind of see the US military in this interregnum where they might not have the capacity, the capability, and the readiness to deter two major adversaries while also dealing with crises around the world. So this is why the US is really doubling down on working with allies and partners to keep some of those additional crises from emerging or keep them at bay, but also thinking about how allies and partners can strengthen deterrence against the two priority adversaries that the United States sees and elucidates in the US National Defense Strategy, which are China and Russia for the most part. And I think that's a really useful context for why there's such an emphasis on allies and partners with integrated deterrence. But the most important thing to remember is integrated deterrence is really just a catchphrase for plain old conventional deterrence. But the emphasis on trying to incorporate allies and partners more into the US efforts to deter both the major adversaries as well as persistent threats, I think is a useful push and one that frankly started in the 2018 NDS but didn't come to fruition because it fell by the wayside with NDS implementation processes. So really now we have the opportunity to take the next step and incorporate allies and partners, but perhaps maybe worth considering how integrated deterrence itself might not be a follow-on concept if there happens to be a new administration in 2024. That said, I do think that working with allies and partners will be a consistent theme. We saw it in 2018. There's a chance that we'll continue to see that in 2024.
Thank you, Becca. That's very helpful, sort of broader strategic context. And obviously, the political reality of democracy, which means elections and potential turnover. And just as this is being thought through and implemented, shunted aside potentially. You raised a really interesting point about, and I've thought about integrated deterrence in this way. On the one hand, it reflects it's sort of plain old deterrence, as you said, but it also, I think, does reflect an honest grappling with a really rapidly shifting strategic context, but also one in which there's the resource question. The U.S. doesn't have the capabilities and the capacities to handle all these issues. And this is why allies and partners are so important, which is also why their perspectives and how they view this is so important. And so I want to turn to both of our other speakers. I'll start with you, B, in Seoul. How does Seoul view or understand the concept of integrated deterrence?
Sure. First of all, I also want to, can you hear me? Yes. I want to thank you for this wonderful opportunity to join the great panel with you. Regarding the question, actually, you began the question in the beginning that you were looking for a kind of definition of the term. Well, obviously, in South Korea as well, we do not have a single definition of what this integrated deterrence means in terms of US's kind of national defense strategy. But I think I should answer this question in terms of how this concept has differently debated or discussed in South Korea, so in kind of a chronological context. When the first term, integrated deterrence, came out with the national defense strategy, I think the consensus has been made that the term entails both continuity and also kind of new aspects in showing US's national defense strategy. Continuity in terms of, as Becca and Clint just said, it's a plain old term for conventional deterrence. And if we look at US's Soviet Union competition, this whole of government approach, the integrated deterrence, has been always there. US has tried to compile the resources, approach multi-domain regions, and seek allied cooperation and also partners as well. So in that sense, it's not a new idea or concept or a big shift in US's defense strategy, but definitely there is a new aspect that we have discussed. One, when it first came out, it rang a deep China target context. Now with after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's more the threat is not only China, but when the term was first came out, and also you would recall that the integrated deterrence was also discussed as the cornerstone of US's Indo-Pacific strategy. So when it first came out, the focus was on how US is viewing China. And Becca also mentioned in the beginning, she already mentioned, the second point was kind of renewed emphasis on nuclear pillar when it comes to deterrence in US's strategy. That seemed like a change. And then this is not written in the US's national defense strategy, but if we look at how NATO and European allies and also in the Pacific allies are using the term, there is also discussion that this US's integrated deterrence approach isn't new in the sense that before, US has been trying to integrate the allies and partners to bring together for US to deter and defend a specific regional ally in the region. But now, with European allies coming to the Indo-Pacific and also US-Japan-South Korea relations developing in this region, it seems like the integration also occurs in the sense that allies and partners themselves are supporting each other's efforts. So with and without US ally, the integrated deterrence seems to emphasize that. And if I may just add a few more points. When the first integrated deterrence was announced, I think a lot of discussions occurred on the tactical levels, what this would mean for ROK-US's CIPOI integration of the information sharing, and also the integration of the missile defense regions. And also when it comes to the logistics in times of contingency, how would this trilateral be integrated under this term? And these are some of the challenges that we will, I think, discuss later. So I'll keep it there.
Thank you, Bea. Jim, I know you've discussed this with various Japanese officials. So, what do you gather as the view from Tokyo?
Sure. No, thank you. Thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be with you all. First off, I would just say, in addition to what's been discussed on the National Defense Strategy, I think it's important to highlight their emphasis on the tailored aspect of integrated deterrence, the idea that the shape of integrated deterrence depends to a large extent on exactly what we're trying to deter. So they try to put in a China, Russia, North Korea kind of context of some of these different concepts. And I think that is applicable in the trilateral context going forward. Number two, on the idea of really encouraging or emphasizing the involvement of allies and partners. In the Japanese context, I think they're pushing on an open door. There's a lot of interest in Japan on that front and expanding their own security relationships with Australia, with the UK, et cetera. So there's a lot of opportunity there. In terms of where the rubber is meeting the road on integrated deterrence, the U.S. is putting forward the January 2+2 meeting here has a whole statement and agreements between the U.S. and Japan on the way forward, including, for example, the shifting of the 12th Marine Regiment in Okinawa into a Marine Littoral Regiment, an MLR that has enhanced surveillance, air defense, long-range maritime strike, littoral combat team, et cetera. So there's a shift in terms of how some of the services are adapting to integrated deterrence, and that is having a tangible impact on the force composition and the way that U.S. forces will want to operate within Japan. So there's at the tactical level, there really are some interesting components to that. In terms of Japan's view of it, I think they're interested in it. They see it, not surprisingly, almost as much in a non-military context as in a military context. So, of course, and it depends on what job you have, what ministry you're in terms of how you interpret this. I think the Ministry of Defense and the self-defense forces certainly have a more military view about it. They are rolling out a permanent joint headquarters for the very first time. So this idea of jointness, of multi-domain, cross-domain operations, I think they view integrated in the context of really integrating their forces and integrating cyber and space and other pieces in terms of what they do. But the foreign ministry, I think, is looking at it from the diplomatic perspective. So the G7 is very much a part of integrated deterrence to some extent, pushing back a little bit or emphasizing the Taiwan Straits, peace across the Taiwan Strait as important for the world, not just for Taiwan or not just for Asia, kind of countering President Macron's comment that maybe this is somehow an issue somewhere else. All of that, I think, feeds into this idea of integrated deterrence because it's diplomatic, it's sanctions on Russia. Succeeding in against Russia helps deter China. I think the foreign ministry is viewing it that way, and the METI, the Economic Trade and Industry Ministry, sees the economic security context and some of the supply chain issues and on those areas. And I think on the politicians' side in Japan, they're viewing, to some extent, the nuclear piece they have an eye on, and building up Japan's defense industry as a part of, so that gets into the institutional piece. So everybody sees it a little bit differently, but I think it's useful because more players in Japan now feel that they have a stake in, or a role to play in deterrence, and together with the United States. So that's opening up a lot of opportunities, I think.
Thank you, Jim. I'm going to turn to Becca for the two-finger, but for your report, of course, you interviewed a lot of policymakers throughout the region, so I'm sure you've got something to add.
Yeah, no, I think Jim raised something that's really interesting, which is looking at how different players within Japan, based on where they sit, have viewed all of this. And then I think it's really important to put that in the context, the US context, which is integrated deterrence is ultimately a US Department of Defense concept. It was created by Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. It has been almost entirely what the Pentagon has been seized with. It was included in the US National Security Strategy that was put out by the White House. But in some ways, that was sort of a call-out box, if you will. It hasn't actually been White House and the US interagency as a whole of government concept. So I think it's really important to put that in sort of stark contrast to how some foreign capitals are interpreting integrated deterrence, because while the concept does seek to use different elements of national power, it doesn't quite work because this isn't a concept that the U.S. Department of Treasury has adopted. This isn't really a huge area of emphasis for the U.S. State Department. So because of that, I think there needs to be an understanding that there may be some limits to what integrated deterrence can actually do, because it's going to be, for the most part, resourced and implemented by the U.S. Department of Defense rather than the U.S. government writ large.
Thank you. And that's a point if we have time, hopefully can circle back to later. Jim, I see another.
Sorry, just very quickly, the issue of resources came up, and I think it's still worth putting into context. So the U.S. defense budget, and if you put all of defense, Department of Energy, defense components, $858 billion this year. It's $76 billion more than last year. It was $46 billion more, $45 billion more than was actually requested. So $76 billion more than last year. That's, as much as the U.S. is happy about Japan spending more on defense and increasing defense spending, that's a budget and a half. That's an entire year and a half of Japan's budget just on top of what we're already spending. So I think the resources are there from the U.S. side, but it is this issue of integration, or how they come together to make the most effective use of them, is the crux of it.
Thank you, Jim. We've given sort of the individual government pieces or views. Trilateralism is in the name of the program. So what are some key existing examples, and Bea started to allude to this in her previous response, but what are some key existing examples of trilateral integration along the three sort of prongs that you've defined in your report: tactical, institutional, and strategic? I might circle back to you, Bea, since you began to mention this.
Sure. Well, I will start with the tactical level first. I think the integrated deterrence these days, in this week especially, is discussed in the context of this building US-ROK-Japan sharing of real-time data on North Korea's missile launches. So I think, as you all know, in the Trilateral Summit last November, we agreed on this idea. And of course, there are challenges in integrating the systems at the tactical level. We have a lot to do, but we had previous experiences already. For instance, in 2016 in Hawaii during the RIMTAC exercise, we had the first trilateral exercise in detecting and tracking North Korea's missiles. And also more recently, last October, in response to North Korea's nuclear missile launch, the test launch, which flew over Japan Again, we had the Ronald Reagan Strike Group in the EC working with South Korea and Japan leaderships to do the tracking of the ballistic missile exercise. So the tactical level in terms of the data sharing, I think that's in the forefront of the agenda that we are, the trilateral countries are pushing, especially this week and onwards. And on the, then going back to the strategic level, I think trilaterally the discussion is moving beyond North Korea, and that's a development. And as you all know, Taiwan issue or China issue has not been discussed, especially in terms of South Korea and US context. But as you know, in the many conferences outside and inside are developing and discussing candid ideas about how this regional security threats would evolve. So on the strategic level, of course, there are not fully seamless convergence of the threat perception, and priorities, of course, cannot be all the same, but I think there is a change going towards that area. And also institutional, I guess it's also the information sharing that I already talked about. So, and also R&D, I'll keep that for the next kind of round of question that you had in the list.
All right, thank you.
Yes.
Jim, would you like to?
Sure. No, I mean, I agree with that description. I would add maybe anti-submarine warfare as an emerging tactical area of trilateral experimentation and exercises. And then whether this is institutional or whether this is strategic, I'm not completely sure. Maybe more institutional. If we talk about tailored, if we're talking about trilateral, I think we're mostly talking about North Korea. We are, as Professor mentioned, expanding it a little bit beyond that. But so the nuclear component is almost more uniquely relevant to the trilateral piece. There is the new nuclear consultation group being created between the US and South Korea. Of course, this builds upon a history of bilateral extended deterrence dialogues that the US has had with both South Korea and with Japan. There's been some discussion about whether or not that should kind of merge and be more of a trilateral discussion. I'm of the view that two separate bilateral engagements are more appropriate and more efficient because the needs and the political environment is a little different. But I think there need to be some linkages between them, or there are some natural linkages in terms of strategic, in terms of decision-making, political accountability for the use or non-use of nuclear weapons in case there is some kind of North Korean use. So you want all three countries to be on the same page about how the US responds in that regard. So I could see an elevation of consultations there. And then we had the recent trilateral embarkation of subfleet leaders on the USS Ohio off of Guam, first time ever, all three together on a nuclear ballistic submarine, which I think is also a useful message as well. So the detailed consultations maybe are more bilateral, but there is a trilateral role to play, I think, in the nuclear realm.
So just to, I mean, I agree wholeheartedly with both Bea and Jim. I think to switch things up and make things a little bit different, I'll point to where we need to go next within some of those examples, because, you know, as Jim just alluded to, for the most part, we do have some things that are occurring on more of a bilateral basis rather than a trilateral basis. So at the tactical level, I think some of the recent military exercises that we've seen in the announcement that, you know, they're going to increase some of the trilateral military exercises, particularly in anti-submarine warfare, really heartening to see. But with the exercises that have existed, it's very much still almost the US hub and spoke system, where you have the US in the middle cooperating with the Republic of Korea. We have the US also cooperating with Japan, and not so much Japan and the Republic of Korea cooperating together, or in all three really acting in tandem. So trying to shift from having more of that hub and spoke system within military exercises to true interoperability, where all three are operating and cooperating together is definitely an aspiration, and one that I hope we are going to see more of as some more of these exercises become familiarized and become a little bit more routine. I think at the institutional level, I agree with Bee's point on some of the information sharing that's emerged almost on an ad hoc basis around threat monitoring and ballistic missile defense. I definitely would put that more at the institutional level personally than tactical. But I think, again, these mechanisms have emerged and can be stood up when needed. I think trying to institutionalize them a little bit more and make these standing mechanisms would do well to really reinforce the trilateral relationships, as well as engender the level of trust that I think you would need to see in order to get to true strategic level integration. And examples of true strategic integration that we're seeing, there are a bunch of tabletop exercises and war games, usually that are sort of track 1.5, that are usually run by third-party organizations. That's an example of starting to have those strategic level discussions, as Bea alluded to. I think it's a good step in the right direction of building that foundation of trust that will allow for sort of the frank and honest conversation and information sharing that you need to do in order to achieve strategic integration. But we're not quite there yet. And I think that there's a long way to go in building that kind of trust before, there's going to be the level of familiarity where states are comfortable sharing, really sensitive information and things like national caveats. But, the fact that they exist is already a step in the right direction, and it's just continuing to build on those a little bit more to get to, I think, where we all would like to be.
That's like parsing the different levels of integration, right? There's sort of strategic level signaling or messaging, and you might have a degree of cohesion there, but then when you start to scratch a little bit beneath the surface and the caveats and the different positions, it gets complicated real quick. And I think about, and Jim, you alluded to this in the Japan context, but the Yoon Suk-yeol administration, and in fact it began under his predecessor, Moon Jae-in, they have in alliance documents and in their own Indo-Pacific strategy began to highlight the importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait in ways they had not previously done, similarly with the Japanese. And they've begun to tie that directly to peace and security of the Korean Peninsula in the South Korean Indo-Pacific strategy, which was a very unique linkage in all my tracing of documents. I've never seen that before. But when questions get publicly raised about what this in fact means in the event, God forbid, of a contingency or sort of simultaneous conflict, it gets very complicated. What role will the U.S. forces in Korea play, potentially in a Taiwan contingency? What demands will fall on the South Koreans, not only vis-a-vis Taiwan, but also in dealing with, obviously, the more immediate and urgent threat they face. Obviously not easy answers to these things. So that turns to challenges, which I sort of asked you all ahead of time. What are some key challenges moving forward to deepening integration on these different levels? Maybe I'll turn to you again, Bea.
Yes, I think the major challenges, especially in case of South Korea, arise from internal political polarizations, and we have divided views on China, we have divided views on North Korea, we have divided views on trilateral cooperation, and this makes it very difficult to fasten the process. And especially when it comes to, for instance, the military effectiveness of this information sharing. If you have been following Korean media, it's divided into two parts. On one side, they say we have already the arrangement of TISA restored GSOMIA, and there may not be much needed effectiveness by making this data sharing mechanism. On the other hand, which is the government's position and many proponents of the support of the trilateral integration, is that there is the military effectiveness. The radars that South Korea has does not fully cover when the trajectories of the missiles, for instance, that are launched to the northeastern side of the north, and these are better captured by Japan's radars and detective systems. So even when it comes to the technological effectiveness, it is politically divided, and I think that makes the political leadership make it not easy. But for that sense, I think this President Yoon Suk-yeol government has been very strongly taking a great lead in this project. So there are political challenges to be solved at home. And also in terms of South Korea's political challenges, everyone knows we have the Japan-South Korea relations, which has been in many ways development compared to last administration, but there is still a lot to do, and we are working very hard to make this possible. So every time we talk about trilateral cooperation, it seems like South Korea is a little bit always lagging behind the process where US and Japan is going ahead. But I would take it as right now we are in the positive development side, and that's a good point, right? And then I would add one more point, which is on the military level. When it comes to integrated deterrence, as Clint already alluded in his comment, I think trilateral cooperation can be challenging when it comes to really delineating the division of labor, what we will do, how would the USFK play in this context. Even we are now very actively discussing many different scenarios of this Taiwan contingency. Still, there is no single answer, and the division of labor becomes, it cannot be solved at once. So that makes this process a lengthier time than we would want it to be, and that's the challenge that we are having.
Thank you, Jim.
Sure. On the Japan front, I mean, there are political challenges as well. They don't stem as much from political division as they do from just the political difficulty of accommodating the evolving defense concepts that the U.S. is putting out there. On the joint staff is pushing this idea of expanded maneuver, that they're going to have to deal with contested logistics, more joint fires, more from various positions. Agile combat employment, the Air Force kind of idea of dispersing aircraft and moving things around, this whole idea of being able to move more freely with more lethality in each of these different smaller components is going to be very hard to accommodate within the Japanese political system in terms of where these assets go within Japan. The U.S. wants to be able to use other Japanese bases that they're not currently on to put assets there, maybe even civilian airports or ports or broadening there. So I think it's the accommodation of that that's going to be the most difficult. Then there's this idea, we've seen it talked about, the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission last year recommended a study on the idea of intermediate range ballistic missiles or some kind of enhancing the U.S. Missile deployment in and around the Southwest Islands in Japan to be part of the deterrence vis-a-vis China. That's going to be extremely politically sensitive and difficult within Japan. I think you're going to get, frankly, not IRBMs there, but there probably will be an enhancement of shorter range capability, anti-ship capability, and enhancing defenses there. On the institutional front, we face a lot of challenges, I think, because our institutions are so different. The trust is there, but the equivalency of information security, the defense industry capability. So on the defense industrial front, Japan is developing a new fighter aircraft. Instead of working with a U.S. partner directly as a major partner, it's working with BAE in the UK and with Italy. But there still are other areas that the U.S. is working with Japan, whether some of this can be expanded into the trilateral on hypersonic missile defense, UAV development. Those are the areas bilaterally U.S. and Japan are focused on. I think there's some potential there. Frankly, the strategic is better between the U.S. and Japan, I think, even almost than the institutional. And so the strategic is kind of helping improve the tactical despite the institutional challenges that we face. And we're working to enhance command and control relationships, for example. The US-Japan have a very antiquated approach. They're envious of the Japan is envious of the US-South Korea relationship, and they're exploring, it won't be a combined command in Japan, but I think there will be a more enhanced bilateral command in the future, or at least a joint bilateral staff office. You may have a joint task force Japan be established by Indo-PACOM there. So there'll be more substance to the US-Japan military integration or cooperation component. And that could be a piece then that CFC and USFK can work with. So there's more potential down the road. That's where the opportunities come, I think, at various levels on that front. And then finally, we haven't talked much about the space piece, cybersecurity, and then science and technology research and development, some of the dual use technology, kind of economic security cooperation. I know that's on the agenda trilaterally, so I think that's got some potential as well.
Thank you, Jim. Bea and Jim, you've run through quite a few challenges and opportunities, but Becca, you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I'll just talk about some of the barriers to greater cooperation, specifically at the institutional and strategic levels from the U.S. side, right? Because the U.S. may be pressing for integrated deterrence and greater cooperation at the trilateral level, but we got to look at ourselves and realize all the barriers that we put up to working with us and that hinder, bilateral relations, but also trilateral relations. So if you're looking at the institutional level, I think the most important thing that I want to point out here are the significant barriers that exist to co-development and co-production of military capabilities, which also in some ways extend to some of the advanced technologies that the United States has prioritized for both, civil and military purposes. So here, I think the greatest hindrance is U.S. export controls, and specifically ITAR. ITAR makes it very unattractive for other states to work with the United States on the development of military capabilities, because there's this idea that, if the United States even works on a small component of a broader capability, that ITAR taint, right? That the restrictions on using that capability still exist. So if you have a small US radio in a larger system, there's still going to be a variety of restrictions on how different countries could use that capability, for example. And so I think, as Jim pointed out, I think this is one of the reasons why we've seen Japan partnering with the UK and Italy on their next generation fighter. Trying to work with the United States is, it's slow, it is cumbersome, and it means that countries don't have the flexibility to build, develop, and use some of those capabilities in the ways that they would like to see fit. In fact, this has been actually a boon for South Korea's domestic defense industry, which has a little bit more lax rules around some of the smart capabilities that they have developed and sold around the world, including to key U.S. partners in Europe. So ITAR remains a pretty sizable barrier. I think if we're looking at other areas, I think Australia is finding this to be very difficult already, and I think it's going to also impact the future of AUKUS in terms of Pillar 2 technologies. So I think that is in some ways a warning call. So if we're looking at ways of deepening trilateral military capabilities or the development of them, it's not necessarily a good news story. And then the last challenge that I'll point out at the strategic level, which, to be honest, there's a number of challenges, is really around the information sharing and the excessive use of U.S. no foreign security designation. So no foreign stands for not releasable to foreign nationals, and is one of the security designations that the U.S. Department of Defense uses. And there's information that the United States should keep in-house. Let us just acknowledge that, and I think it is worth really pointing that out on the back of some of the recent leaks that we have seen. However, no foreign has moved from being the exception to the rule. Pretty much there's an overclassification of products at the no foreign level that make it really hard for them to go through the adjudication process and become releasable to even the United States' closest allies and partners. And so they hinder conversations about, the prioritization of threats, the most pressing scenarios, what the United States would even expect from some of its allies and partners in various contingencies to get at that most important division of labor question. And because of that, we're not having those conversations at the levels that we should be and at the level of frankness that we ought to have. And, while there's obviously reasons why, other countries are reticent to talk about their own national caveats, again, I think we in the United States have to look at our own selves and the processes and procedures that we've put in place that are equally as burdensome and keep us from having those conversations as well.
Yeah. That's a bleak picture you just painted.
Sorry, I'm
it's-
pessimist. I
no,
read all
I
black
appreciate
for a
that.
reason.
The clarity on that.
At the tactical level, though, I totally agree with you. But at the tactical level, Indo-PACOM is pushing and enhancing their ability to create what they call mission partner environments, which are kind of, at the tactical level, little clouds or ability to share information related to a particular mission. So there are some improvements there, but I totally agree. It's not existing at the strategic level where this all should begin.
Tactical is low-hanging fruit, right?
Yeah.
It's easy. It is a common, if you're talking about key warfighting missions, those are common things that everyone understands. And if you're sharing information, it's about, in a either a live exercise environment about, here's where the threat is, what do you do, how do you pass that information on? It's also worth noting that a lot of those mission environments are really at the bilateral level, as opposed to even, expanded to a multilateral level. So there's still some key, challenges there as well.
Becca, you raised a really important point that I do hopefully want to get to about, you said looking, sort of at ourselves on the U.S. side within. I am interested in the sort of intra-bureaucratic challenges within each national government. But I want to give our audience a chance to pose questions. So if there's anybody in person here, I see a hand's gone up immediately. So we'll bring a microphone to you, Dr. Park. And if you're online, please, if you have a question, pose it in the chat box and we will get to that as well. And if you have a particular speaker in mind, please say so. And if you wouldn't mind identifying yourself.
So, which direction is the camera?
As you are.
Okay. Thank you very much for this hosting this beautiful chance, and thank you for inviting me to participate today, Dr. Wok. And I'm South Korean Navy retired captain, Joshua Namtae Park, and PhD from Texas A&M University. And today, first I want to greet Dr. Jo. I had worked for 카이라 too. 저 군사센터에 근무했던 박남태입니다. 반갑습니다. 의견 잘 들었습니다. 감사합니다. This is question for Dr. James Scoff about the Japanese view. My question is, at this time, what is the Japanese motive, the most significant motive to proceed or advance cooperation with South Korea? I will give you two options. First one is Japanese necessity against growing concerns about China, or U.S. push to Japan to get along with South Korea. Because it is very important with 3 points. First, if they have the necessity of Japanese necessity in terms of cooperating with Korea, the sustainability of cooperation will last. I mean, those activities will last The second will impact on the level of commitment of Japan with cooperation. The third, the most of the conjunction area between China and South Korea and Japan is Navy. Then I was Navy officer. Then I'm really interested in. Then those of U.S. has pushed South Korea and Japan to get along with and improve or enhance cooperation whenever some conflict happen. As you know that.
Dr. Park, I might ask you just
Okay.
to wrap up.
Then I want to ask that at this moment, what is the most significant motive of Japan to advance or improve the cooperation with South Korea? That's my question, sir.
No,
Thank
thank
you.
you very much. And the two motivations you posed, I think, are elements there in terms of the China piece and the U.S. pushing piece. But I think the biggest motivation is the recognition that, or the belief in Japan and the security community that they are way behind in terms of readiness, in terms of being able to deal with the China challenge, in terms of expectations vis-a-vis Taiwan. The Ukraine invasion by Russia has really changed the game there. So I think in terms enhancing focus on the East China Sea and that area, but still having a very powerful North Korean missile and nuclear capability there. So in a way, I think it's about being able to enhance Japan's security vis-a-vis North Korea, first and foremost. I think there also is this idea, we focus a lot on interoperability, right? In terms of being interoperable among our different forces. A higher level goal, I think, would be interchangeability, which would be different in the context of it's not just that we can work together, but if a mission needs to be handled, whether it's an ASW mission or a missile defense watch or other types, US, South Korean, and Japanese assets, if they are interchangeable and the three of us can cover a board with different assets that can work together and say, okay, well, I can put this ship there and it can work in that role, and then somebody else can use their ship elsewhere. I mean, I think from a Japanese perspective, that's the only way. They're not growing their force. Their self-defense forces are the same number. They're spending more money, but it's a declining number of people. So I think that's the main motivation on the military side. Of course, there's political and diplomatic benefits as well.
Thank you, Jim. We have a question from online.
Yes. So Mr. Mark Fitzpatrick from online asks, anyone willing to quantify the degree of tactical, institutional, strategic integration between Japan and South Korea on a scale of 0 to 10?
Between Japan and South Korea?
Of course, Mark Fitzpatrick asks the hardest question. Good job, Mark.
All we have to do is say a number, so it's easy to answer. Right?
You want to be sporty, go for it.
Well, between Japan and South Korea, I'd say 3. I think there's a lot of opportunity and a long way to go. It doesn't have to be kinetic, blowing things up. There's logistics, there's ISR sharing, but it's there. The missile defense piece has pushed it in the past. Fisheries, Coast Guard, there's on the maritime space, there've been some progress, but I'd say 3. I don't know what Dr. Joe thinks.
B or Becca, do you want to hazard a out of 10 quantification?
Maybe I'll go for 5. But I totally agree that there's long way to many things to go, but we are getting there, I think. And also, I think we should distinguish from U.S. and South Korea and South Korea, Japan. One is alliance and one is cooperation. So, yeah, maybe 4 or 5. Yes, Becca.
I work on U.S. defense, so I'm not even going to hazard a guess over here.
Fair enough. Do we have any questions in the room? Troy.
Hi, Troy Saron with the Korea Economic Institute. Jim, so I want to push on your open door on cyber from earlier and kind of get your thoughts on how that could be improved, how it might work. And I want to give a little context to that. Some of the things I've been reading about Russia and the Ukraine war is that everybody was surprised that, well, there wasn't a big cyber attack and that, maybe cyber isn't going to be an important component. But as we've gotten further into the war, it's come out that one, the Russians were successful in disrupting Ukrainian communications early in the war. But two, that one of the reasons why they don't think there was a major cyber attack is that because so few people even knew there was going to be an invasion, that basically you have to plant all these things in advance and run the operations well in advance. And so Russia couldn't lay the groundwork. That may not be the case going forward. So what do you see really as the challenges of potential for cybersecurity cooperation trilaterally? Because if we look at this, we know on the US side that subcontractors are often the weak link in US cyber. But more broadly, I think it's fair to say that Japan and South Korea are even further behind on cyber. So kind of how do we address this concern and what do you see as the challenges? And then I know we're talking about trilateral, but Beck, I'd be curious. It seems if we're going to have integrated defense, it needs to be more than trilateral. So do you see opportunities or the need to go beyond just the US, South Korea, and Japan? Thank you.
I ask Jim and Becca to be as brief as you can with such a complex issue.
Sure. First of all, I mean, good question. I would say the baseline right now is very low, so any improvements will be useful and measurable. Japan, in its new defense budget and national security strategy, is putting a lot more money into the cybersecurity piece. They're going to reconfigure how they manage and organize cybersecurity within the whole government. Training people, getting more people capable is first and foremost. I just think there's a lot of opportunity in terms of sharing best practice, sharing data, the misinformation, disinformation side of things. The information warfare is maybe not cybersecurity per se, but that's something that Taiwan is experiencing constantly, and it's a possible avenue of connection with Taiwan in a non-lethal kind of security, national security cooperation area, and I think then it's the private sector piece. So the whole launch of the business federations, investment in the future, there should be a real cybersecurity component there. It's collaborating on ransomware and other stages. So I don't want to say this is somehow an easy thing to accomplish, or we're going to have major effects in the short term, but the basis line right now is so low that I think there are a lot of opportunities there. And the last thing I'd say is, the U.S. is so convinced. Some of the leaks in the Discord files showed that the U.S. expects China to be able to penetrate some of even our defense systems within 10 years or this or that. So the challenge is so great that we need to build other avenues of security and communication.
Yeah, if I can just really quickly build on that, I think one area where that commonly gets overlooked when we're talking about cybersecurity and cyber options, I think there's going to need to be a greater level of cooperation with industry. And specifically, if we're looking at some of the commercial technologies that we've seen come to, that have been really, really important in Ukraine, looking at Starlink, among others, you could imagine how some of those technologies could also be applicable to a potential future conflict in the Indo-Pacific with China. So trying to think about ways to ensure that there's a certain level of cyber resiliency within industry and within the commercial systems, whether that's commercial space or just commercial communication systems, that's going to be incredibly important moving forward. Your question looking at, should we be expanding beyond the trilateral? Absolutely. I think there's a benefit to continuing to strengthen bilateral relationships the trilateral relationship, but also multilateral relationships. I think you've seen the Biden administration has really been a fan of these sort of ad hoc minilateral groupings. We've seen that with the Quad, with AUKUS. I think you are probably going to see a renewed or a new emphasis on trying to see where Japan, Philippines, and Australia could deepen levels of cooperation as well, just because if you're looking at a potential Taiwan contingency, the United States does have some thinking that, you know, the three countries within the region that are most likely to provide access and overflight and potential military contributions themselves would be Australia, Japan, keeping in line with its constitutional priorities, as well as the Philippines. Although we all know that based on domestic politics in the Philippines, you know, it's best to sort of think of that access and participation as conditional at best.
Well, obviously an hour is insufficient to define what is still an undefined concept, but I think we've put a lot of food for thought out there. And we'll see, of course, there'll be a trilateral meeting on the sideline of the G7 in the coming days. I understand there won't be a joint statement, but there will be reporting about essentially how the three leaders have assessed progress thus far on many of the issues that we've mentioned here today. Because we're up against, in fact, past time, we don't have any time for closing thoughts, but I do want to thank all of our speakers, Bea, Becca, and Jim, for joining us today. And thank you everyone here and online as well for joining us. Have a nice day.